I never thought that summer on the farm would change everything. It started simply enough: dusty mornings, early sunrises, and the earthy smell of hay lingering in the air. My cousin, Leah, had come to help after a long stretch of city life. She was a few years older, more world-weary, or so it seemed at first. We hadn't been close growing up, but spending weeks together in the secluded quiet of the farm would draw us together in ways I never anticipated. At first, we worked side by side, laughing and talking about nothing in particular: how different the farm was from her usual life, her plans once she returned home, the familiar rhythm of our days. There was nothing out of the ordinary about our conversations, nothing inappropriate, but it was the way she looked at me sometimes that made my heart race. I tried to ignore it at first, convincing myself I was imagining things. But the way she lingered when she touched my arm, the way her eyes followed me when I wasn't looking, it became impossible to ignore. We spent long, hot afternoons working in the fields, sweat beading on our skin as we tossed hay and fed the animals. Leah had a natural grace about her, moving effortlessly even in the summer heat. I noticed it more and more: her slim figure, the way her hair fell around her face when she laughed. It was becoming harder to pretend these observations were just cousinly admiration. I started to look forward to our late evening talks on the porch. The sun would be setting, the sky painted in shades of pink and orange, casting a warm glow over everything. We'd sit close together on the old wooden bench, sipping cold lemonade, our knees brushing occasionally. It was always accidental, or at least it seemed that way at first. But as the nights wore on, those brief touches began to linger. My pulse would quicken whenever her hand grazed mine, and I knew she could feel the tension building between us. One night, as the stars began to twinkle in the sky, Leah shifted slightly, her knee pressing more firmly against mine. Neither of us moved. The air between us felt heavy with something unspoken, something I was terrified to acknowledge. I glanced over at her and our eyes locked. There was something in her gaze, an intensity one hadn't seen before. It made my breath catch, and for a moment, I thought she might say something, but she just smiled softly and turned her eyes back to the stars. The following days were a blur of subtle touches and quiet moments charged with an intensity one didn't understand. We'd brush against each other while passing tools, or she'd stand a little too close when we worked together in the barn. It was all innocent on the surface, but beneath it, there was a current of something deeper, something forbidden. I could feel it in the way my skin tingled whenever she touched me, the way my thoughts wandered to her more often than they should. One afternoon, we were working in the barn, stacking hay bales. The sun streamed in through the open door, casting a golden light across the room. Leah stood close, her hand brushing against mine as we worked. My heart raced, and I knew she could feel the tension between us just as much as I did. She caught my eye, her lips parting slightly as if she wanted to say something, but instead, she reached out and touched my arm, just a light, fleeting touch, but it sent a jolt through me that I couldn't ignore. I froze, unsure of how to react. My mind raced, trying to make sense of the flood of emotions that surged through me. Leah's fingers lingered on my arm for just a second too long, her touch gentle but deliberate. When I finally met her eyes, there was no mistaking the look she gave me. It wasn't playful or teasing. It was something deeper, something that sent a shiver down my spine. "Is everything okay?" she asked, her voice soft, almost vulnerable. It was such an ordinary question, but there was an undercurrent in her tone that told me this was no ordinary moment. I swallowed hard, nodding, but my voice failed me. My thoughts were tangled, a whirlwind of confusion and desire that I couldn't unravel. The barn suddenly felt too small, the air too thick. I stepped back, needing distance, but the space between us felt charged, like a taut wire waiting to snap. Leah didn't say anything, but she didn't move either. She just stood there, watching me with those intense eyes that seemed to see right through me. I turned away, pretending to focus on the task at hand, but my hands were trembling. I felt her presence behind me, close but not touching, and every fiber of my being was hyper-aware of her. The rest of the afternoon passed in a blur. I kept my distance as best I could, but every time I caught a glimpse of her out of the corner of my eye, the tension between us grew. By the time we finished our chores and headed back to the farmhouse, I could barely breathe. I wasn't sure what was happening between us, but I knew that something had changed, and there was no going back. That night, we sat on the porch again, just like we always did, but this time, the silence was heavy with unspoken words. I could feel Leah's gaze on me, but I didn't dare look at her. My heart was pounding in my chest, my mind racing with thoughts I couldn't control. What was I supposed to do? What was she thinking? Did she feel it too, this undeniable pull between us? Or was I imagining it all? Suddenly, Leah broke the silence. "Do you remember when we were kids?" she asked, her voice soft, almost wistful. "We used to play hide and seek in the fields. I always thought it was funny how you could never find me." I laughed, a little too quickly, grateful for the distraction. "You were always better at hiding than me." She smiled, but there was something in her expression that made my stomach flip. "I think I just knew you too well. I knew where you'd look, where you wouldn't." There was again that feeling that she was saying something more, something I wasn't ready to hear. I shifted uncomfortably, my fingers gripping the edge of the porch railing. Leah leaned in slightly, her shoulder brushing against mine. "It's funny how things change, isn't it? How people change." Her words hung in the air between us, and I could feel my pulse quicken. I didn't trust myself to respond. The warmth of her body so close to mine was, "I guess so," I managed, my voice strained. She didn't say anything for a moment, just sat there, her knee resting lightly against mine, her fingers tracing the wood of the porch. Then, without warning, she reached out and placed her hand on top of mine. It was such a simple gesture, but it sent a shockwave through me. I should have pulled away. I should have said something, anything to break the moment. But I didn't. I couldn't. Her hand was warm, soft, and for a long moment, we just sat there in silence, our hands touching, neither of us moving. My mind was screaming at me to stop, to pull away, but my body wouldn't listen. All I could think about was how right it felt, how much I didn't want this moment to end. "I think about you sometimes," Leah said quietly, breaking the silence. "More than I should." Her words hung in the air, heavy and loaded with meaning. I felt my breath catch in my throat, my heart pounding in my chest. This was it, the moment where everything would either fall apart or move forward into something neither of us could undo. I didn't know what to say, didn't know how to respond. But before I could even process what was happening, Leah leaned in, her lips brushing lightly against mine. It was a soft, tentative kiss, like she was testing the waters, waiting to see if I'd pull away. But I didn't. Instead of pulling away, I kissed her back, the soft touch of her lips igniting a fire deep inside me. It was a brief, almost hesitant kiss, but it was enough to send my mind spinning. My pulse pounded in my ears, and my heart raced in a way I'd never felt before. This was wrong, I knew that. But in that moment, nothing else seemed to matter. Leah pulled back slightly, her face inches from mine, her breath warm against my skin. Her eyes searched mine, and I could see the same conflict there that was tearing me apart inside. There was no turning back now, no denying what had just happened. We had crossed a line, and we both knew it. "Leah," I whispered, but I didn't know what to say. Every thought that came to mind seemed too small, too insignificant compared to the storm of emotions swirling inside me. She placed a finger gently on my lips, silencing me. "Don't," she said softly. "We don't have to say anything right now." Her voice was calm, but I could hear the tremor beneath it, the uncertainty that mirrored my own. She moved closer, her body pressing against mine as she rested her head on my shoulder. My heart was racing, and I was painfully aware of how close we were, of the heat radiating from her skin, of the way her breath hitched slightly when she exhaled. For a long time, we just sat there like that, wrapped in the silence of the night, the only sound the distant chirping of crickets and the occasional rustle of leaves in the breeze. I didn't know what to do, didn't know how to make sense of the maelstrom of feelings inside me. Part of me wanted to pull away, to retreat before things went any further, but another part, a much larger part, wanted to stay right there, wanted to hold on to this moment and never let it go. Leah's hand slid down to rest on my arm, her fingers trailing lightly over my skin, sending a shiver through me. I could feel the tension building between us, the unspoken words, the questions we were both too afraid to ask. What were we doing? How could we possibly make sense of this? I shifted slightly, turning toward her, and she looked up at me, her eyes filled with a mix of emotions I couldn't quite place. There was desire there, yes, but also fear and something deeper, something I didn't dare name. I don't know what this is, I finally said, my voice barely above a whisper. But I can't stop thinking about you, Leah. I've tried, but... She smiled sadly, her hand tightening slightly on my arm. I know, she murmured. Me too. For a moment, neither of us spoke. The weight of what was happening between us hung heavy in the air, and I could feel the tension pulling us closer, drawing us towards something we both knew we couldn't undo. It felt like we were standing on the edge of a cliff, both of us terrified to jump, but knowing that we couldn't stay where we were. Then, slowly, Leah leaned in again, her lips brushing against mine, and this time, I didn't hesitate. I kissed her back, my hand sliding up to the back of her neck, pulling her closer. Her body pressed against mine, and the kiss deepened, the tension between us giving way to something more urgent, more raw. Her hands moved to my chest, her fingers tracing the contours of my body as we kissed, slow at first, but growing more intense with each passing second. The world around us seemed to fade away, leaving only the feel of her lips on mine, the warmth of her skin, the way her breath hitched when I touched her. Somewhere in the back of my mind, I knew we shouldn't be doing this, knew that this would change everything. But in that moment, none of that mattered. All I cared about was her, about the way she made me feel, about the connection we shared that was impossible to ignore. We pulled apart, breathless, our foreheads resting against each other as we tried to catch our breath. I could feel the weight of what had just happened settling over us, the reality of it sinking in. But instead of feeling regret or guilt, all I felt was an overwhelming sense of relief, like I had finally given in to something I had been holding back for too long. Leah's hand slid down to rest on mine, and she squeezed gently. I don't know where this is going, she said softly, her voice trembling slightly. But I don't want to stop. I swallowed hard, my heart pounding in my chest. Neither do I. The words hung between us, and the weight of their meaning settled deep inside me. There was no undoing what we had started, no erasing the tension that had been building for weeks. Leah looked at me, her eyes filled with a mix of desire and uncertainty, and I knew she felt it too. The magnetic pull that kept drawing us closer, despite everything that should have stopped us. We sat there in silence for a long time, our hands still touching, our bodies too close for comfort. But there was something strangely comforting in the closeness, something that made the confusion and guilt fade into the background. In that moment, all that mattered was her. The way her eyes searched mine for answers I couldn't give, the way her breath came a little quicker when I touched her hand. Without thinking, I lifted my hand to her face, brushing a loose strand of hair behind her ear. Her skin was soft beneath my fingertips, and she leaned into my touch, her eyes fluttering closed for a brief second before opening again, filled with something raw and vulnerable. We can't go back, she whispered, her voice barely audible. I know, I said, my voice just as soft. But I don't want to. She smiled, but it was a sad smile, tinged with the knowledge that we were stepping into dangerous territory. Neither do I. And just like that, the space between us disappeared. She leaned in, her lips finding mine again. But this time, there was no hesitation, no holding back. The kiss was slow, deliberate, as if we were both savoring the moment, knowing it was a line we couldn't uncross. Her hands slid up my arms, and I pulled her closer, my heart pounding in my chest. Her fingers tangled in my hair as the kiss deepened, our breaths quickening in unison. The tension that had been simmering beneath the surface for so long finally boiled over, and all the emotions we had been suppressing came rushing out. It was intense, electric, and completely undeniable. We broke apart just long enough to catch our breath, our foreheads resting together, the air between us thick with desire. Leah's hands trembled slightly as they traced the line of my jaw, and I couldn't help but smile at the way she looked at me, like she was seeing me for the first time, and yet, like she had known me forever. "This is crazy," she whispered, her breath warm against my lips. "Maybe," I murmured, brushing my thumb over her cheek. "But I don't care." Neither did she, apparently, because the next thing I knew, she was pulling me toward her, her lips crashing into mine again with a hunger that matched my own. Her hands roamed over my body, exploring, as if she couldn't get enough, and I found myself responding in kind, my fingers tracing the contours of her skin, memorizing every curve, every shiver of her breath against my neck. We stumbled back into the house, our lips never parting, our bodies pressed together as we moved in a blur of heated touches and stolen kisses. The world outside didn't exist anymore. There was only Leah and me, lost in a moment we had both known was coming but had been too afraid to admit. By the time we made it upstairs to my room, I was breathless, my mind a whirl of emotions I couldn't quite name. But there was no turning back now. We had crossed the point of no return, and I didn't want to stop. Not now. Not ever. Leah's hands tugged at my shirt, and I pulled it over my head, my pulse racing as I watched her, her eyes dark with desire. She smiled, that same sad, knowing smile, before closing the distance between us again, her lips finding mine in a kiss that sent sparks shooting through my entire body. Clothes fell to the floor in a blur, and soon we were tangled together on the bed, our bodies pressed so close it was hard to tell where one of us ended and the other began. Her skin was soft beneath my fingers, her breath hitching every time I touched her, and I felt an overwhelming need to hold her, to keep her close, to never let go. We moved together slowly at first, our breaths shallow and ragged as we explored each other's bodies, learning every curve, every sigh. But the intensity between us quickly built, and soon the room was filled with the sounds of our gasps and whispered names, the tension that had been building for so long finally finding release. For a moment, time seemed to stop. The world outside the room disappeared, leaving only the heat of her skin, the weight of her body against mine, and the sound of our hearts beating in unison. It was raw, overwhelming, and perfect in its imperfection. When it was over, we lay there in the dark, our bodies still tangled together, our breaths slowly returning to normal. I could feel her heartbeat against my chest, could feel the warmth of her skin beneath my fingertips, and for a moment, everything felt right. But as the minutes ticked by, the weight of what had just happened began to settle over me like a heavy blanket. We had crossed a line, one we couldn't uncross. And while part of me didn't want to regret it, another part knew that things could never be the same again. Leah must have sensed my hesitation, because she shifted slightly, propping herself up on one elbow to look down at me. Her eyes were filled with uncertainty, with questions she wasn't ready to ask. But she didn't say anything. She just lay there, her fingers tracing lazy circles on my chest, waiting for me to speak first. "I don't know what happens now," I admitted, my voice thick with emotion. She smiled, but it didn't reach her eyes. "Neither do I." The silence between us was thick, filled with the weight of everything unspoken. Leah's hand stilled on my chest, her eyes searching mine for some kind of reassurance, something I wasn't sure I could give her. I felt the weight of what we had just done pressing down on me, the reality of it sinking in. We had crossed a line, a forbidden one, and there was no going back. The guilt was there, creeping in around the edges, but it was muted, overshadowed by the lingering warmth of her body against mine and the memories of her touch. Leah sighed softly, rolling onto her back, staring up at the ceiling as if the answers might be written in the shadows above us. The night felt too quiet now, the weight of our actions heavy in the stillness. I lay beside her, listening to the sound of her breathing, feeling the turmoil brewing inside me. What had we done? What had I allowed to happen? I turned my head to look at her, and she glanced back at me, her expression unreadable. For a moment, I wondered if she regretted it, if she wished we could take it all back. But then she reached out, her fingers brushing against mine, and I knew that she was feeling the same thing I was. Conflicted, yes, but not regretful. Not yet, anyway. I don't want to lose you, she whispered, her voice barely audible. Her words cut through the silence, and I felt a pang in my chest. There it was, the fear that had been lurking beneath the surface all along. Whatever happened next, our relationship, whatever it had been before, was changed forever. We had crossed into something new, something dangerous, and we couldn't pretend otherwise. You won't, I said, though I wasn't sure I believed it. We'll figure it out. But how could we? What was there to figure out when everything about this was wrong? The rational part of me knew that we had made a mistake. One born of loneliness, of proximity, of all the emotions we had kept bottled up for too long. But the other part, the part that was still tangled up in the heat of the moment, didn't care. It wanted to hold on to her, to keep her close, to never let go. Leah's fingers tightened around mine, and I could feel the tremor in her touch. What if we can't? I didn't have an answer for that. I didn't know what the future held, didn't know how we could possibly go back to the way things were. But I wasn't ready to let her go either, wasn't ready to face the consequences of what we had done. Not yet. We'll figure it out, I repeated, though the words felt hollow in my mouth. Leah turned to face me again, her eyes dark with emotion. Do you think this was a mistake? She asked, her voice barely above a whisper. I hesitated. Did I? Part of me wanted to say yes, wanted to tell her that this was wrong, that we had crossed a line we never should have. But the other part, the part that still remembered the feel of her lips on mine, the way her body had fit so perfectly against mine, couldn't bring itself to say the words. I don't know, I admitted finally, my voice thick with emotion. I don't know what this is. Her gaze softened, and for a moment, we just looked at each other, the weight of our shared secret hanging heavy between us. I could see the conflict in her eyes, the same battle I was fighting inside. We were both caught in the same trap, torn between the undeniable pull we felt for each other and the knowledge that we couldn't stay on this path without consequences. I didn't expect this, she said softly, her fingers tracing the outline of my hand. But I can't pretend it didn't happen. Neither can I said, my voice barely audible. The room was quiet again, the only sound the soft rustling of the wind outside. I could feel the weight of everything pressing down on me, the enormity of what we had done, and yet, all I wanted in that moment was to hold on to her, to keep her close for just a little longer. Leah shifted beside me, rolling onto her side and resting her head on my chest. Her hair tickled my skin, and I felt the warmth of her breath against me. It was a small gesture, but it was enough to break the tension, enough to remind me that despite everything, we were still here, still together for now. I don't know what happens next, she said, her voice muffled against my chest. Neither do I admitted, wrapping my arm around her and pulling her closer. But we'll figure it out. Together. We lay there in silence for a long time, neither of us wanting to break the fragile peace we had found in each other's arms. The guilt and confusion still lingered, hovering at the edges of my mind, but for now, I pushed it aside. I wasn't ready to face the consequences of our actions, wasn't ready to let go of this moment. Eventually, Leah's breathing slowed, and I realized she had fallen asleep, her body curled against mine. I stared up at the ceiling, my mind racing with thoughts of what came next. There were no easy answers, no simple way out of the mess we had created. But for now, all I could do was hold her close and hope that, somehow, we could find a way forward. As I drifted off to sleep, the weight of the night settled over me like a heavy blanket. There were no guarantees, no promises of what the future would hold. But in that moment, with Leah's body warm against mine, I allowed myself to believe that maybe, just maybe, we could figure it out. The morning light filtered through the curtains, casting a soft glow over the room. I stirred, slowly waking to the warmth of Leah still curled against me. For a moment, everything felt perfect, like the world outside didn't exist, and it was just us. But then the events of the night before came rushing back, and with them, the heavy weight of reality. Leah was still asleep, her face peaceful, her breath slow and steady. I watched her for a moment, my heart aching with the knowledge that whatever this was between us, it couldn't last. We had crossed a line, one that couldn't be erased, and sooner or later, we'd have to face the consequences. But not yet. Not while she was still in my arms, her body pressed against mine like she belonged there. I gently untangled myself from her, careful not to wake her, and sat on the edge of the bed, my mind spinning with thoughts I couldn't quite organize. What was I going to do? What were we going to do? There were no easy answers, no way to go back to the way things had been before. I glanced over at Leah again, the softness of her face tugging at my heart. As if sensing my thoughts, she stirred, her eyes fluttering open. For a brief second, her face brightened with a soft smile, but then I saw the same realization dawn in her eyes, the same weight of what we had done sinking in. "Morning," she said quietly, her voice rough with sleep. "Morning," I replied, my voice strained. I forced a smile, but it didn't reach my eyes. The air between us was thick with the unspoken knowledge that the night had changed everything. She sat up slowly, pulling the sheets around her and looking down at her hands. "We can't stay like this, can we?" I sighed, running a hand through my hair.
"No.
I don't think we can." There it was, the truth we had both been avoiding. As much as I wanted to hold on to this, to hold on to her, I knew it wasn't possible. We had shared something raw, something real, but it was born out of a moment of weakness, out of emotions neither of us fully understood. And now we had to face the consequences. Leah looked at me, her eyes filled with regret and something deeper, something I didn't want to name. "Do you regret it?" she asked, her voice barely above a whisper. I hesitated, the words catching in my throat. Did I regret it? In some ways, yes. I regretted the mess we had made, the line we had crossed. But at the same time, I couldn't bring myself to regret the moments we had shared, the way she had made me feel, the connection we had discovered. "I don't regret being with you," I said finally, my voice thick with emotion. "But I regret that it has to end." She nodded, biting her lip as she looked away. I knew it couldn't last. I didn't want to believe it. The silence between us stretched on, heavy and uncomfortable. I didn't know what to say to make this easier, didn't know how to fix the tangled mess we had created. All I knew was that I didn't want to lose her, even though I already knew I had. Leah stood up slowly, pulling on her clothes in silence. I watched her, my heart aching with every movement, knowing that this was the end of whatever we had started. When she finally turned to face me, her expression was unreadable. "I don't know what happens next," she said softly, her eyes glistening with unshed tears. "But I'll never forget this. I'll never forget you." I swallowed hard, standing up and crossing the room to her. I didn't know what to say, didn't know how to say goodbye to someone who had become so important to me so quickly. But I knew I had to. This wasn't a fairy tale. We couldn't stay lost in the moment forever. "I won't forget you either," I whispered, my voice thick with emotion. "But we have to move on, Leah. We both know that." She nodded, blinking back tears as she looked away. "I know. It's just hard." "I know." For a long moment, we just stood there, the silence between us filled with everything we weren't saying. I wanted to hold her one last time, to kiss her goodbye, but I knew that would only make it harder. So instead, I reached out and took her hand, giving it a gentle squeeze. "Take care of yourself," I said softly, my voice barely above a whisper. "You too." With that, Leah turned and walked out the door, leaving me standing alone in the quiet of the room. I watched her go, my heart heavy with the knowledge that this was the end. There was no going back, no fixing what we had broken. All I could do was let her go and try to move forward. As the door clicked shut behind her, I sat back down on the edge of the bed, my mind swirling with thoughts and emotions I couldn't quite process. The room felt empty without her, and the silence was deafening.
But I knew it was for the best.
We had shared something powerful, something real, but it couldn't last. It never could. And now all I could do was pick up the pieces and try to move on.